Hey there. Tonight, I want to ask you something that sounds quiet at first, almost gentle. The kind of thought that drifts into a room and sits beside the fire without making a sound. What if Earth forgot a civilization that lived here before us? Not a legend with glowing crystals. Not visitors from some cold star. I mean something born here, shaped by this same gravity, this same rain, this same patient planet. Something that learned, built, wondered, and then passed away so completely that the ground itself no longer remembers its name. If that thought gives you a small shiver, good. Hold it softly, because the darker truth hidden inside it is not really about monsters under the soil or towers buried under ice. It is about time. It is about how brutally good this world is at smoothing every sharp corner, how quickly coastlines drown, how mountains collapse into dust, how even memory, if left alone long enough, becomes a quiet stain in stone. Tonight we are going to sit with that possibility. A forgotten age, a missing line in the rock, a world before ours, erased so thoroughly that even asking about it feels a little forbidden. And before we wander too far into that deep and hushed darkness, if this is your kind of slow question, the kind you like to carry into sleep, you can leave a like and subscribe. It helps this small candle of a channel find other curious people in the dark. Now let the room dim a little more. Let your shoulders drop. Let the muscles around your jaw loosen. Breathe in slowly. Breathe out even more slowly. Imagine the firelight lowering itself across old wood, across shelves, across dust that seems to float without falling. There is no rush here, no deadline, only a long, quiet descent into deep time. When most of us say ancient, we are speaking in very small numbers. A few thousand years feels ancient. The first kings of Egypt, the first cities of Mesopotamia, the first scripts pressed into wet clay by a careful hand, even 12,000 years. The age of the earliest villages and fields feels immense to us. Honestly, it already feels like the edge of imagination. We stand in museums in front of stone tools or worn statues and feel that we are looking into an abyss. But to the Earth, that abyss is hardly a breath. This planet is about 4.5 billion years old. Try to feel the weight of that for a moment, not as a number, but as a pressure. Billions of years of rain on bare rock, billions of years of oceans opening and closing, billions of years of continents drifting like slow rafts across a hidden sea of heat. For most of that span, there were no humans. For most of it, there were no mammals. For a great stretch, there was not even life on land, only small living things in water and mud and darkness, waiting, dividing, changing, enduring. And yet that vast silence was not empty. It was crowded with events so large our ordinary language becomes clumsy around them. Mountains rose and were planed flat. Seas flooded deserts and then withdrew. Ice spread over whole regions and retreated. Entire branches of life flourished and disappeared. The world has not been a stage sitting still for life to act upon. It has always been moving under everything, changing its face, taking back what rests too long on the surface. I have always found it strange that we speak of the Earth as though it stores history like a library, as though somewhere beneath our feet there is a complete archive, a neat set of shelves waiting to be opened. But the planet does not keep a library. It keeps fragments. It keeps accidents. It keeps what happened to survive pressure, burial, chemistry, and luck. Everything else it tears apart without malice. Wood softens, darkens, and goes back into soil. Iron flowers with rust and flakes into nothing. Glass cracks. Concrete opens at the seams when roots find it. Bones dissolve unless they are buried quickly, protected, transformed. Even stone, the thing we trust most, does not really stay. It rounds. It spalls. It is split by cold, licked by salt, dragged by rivers, ground by glaciers, swallowed by heat. Time does not simply pass over matter. Time works on matter. So let us imagine, very softly, that somewhere far back in the middle of all that motion, perhaps 100 million years ago, something clever appeared. Not a human, not even necessarily something standing upright under a bright sky, just some form of intelligence, something native to this world, something that learned enough to shape its surroundings in deliberate ways. Maybe it built, maybe it cultivated, maybe it taught, maybe it had social rituals, memory, planning, long cooperation, all the things that make complexity possible. Maybe it lasted not for a season, but for centuries, or for thousands of years, which would feel grand from the inside and be nearly invisible from the outside. Then imagine that it ended. Perhaps not with a dramatic flash. Perhaps not with an impact or a divine punishment or a wall of fire. Maybe it faded under climate stress. Maybe it was broken by shifting seas. Maybe it divided into smaller populations that forgot what had once been shared. Maybe it simply vanished the way most living things vanish, leaving behind no final speech, no sealed chamber, no heroic warning, just absence. Would we know? That is the question. And once it enters the room, it does not leave easily. Because we like to think that intelligence would leave unmistakable evidence. Towers, roads, quarries, writings cut into cliff faces, at least one dramatic object sitting in the wrong layer of stone, waiting for some lucky scientist to brush away the dirt and gasp. But that expectation belongs to us, to our habits, to our preferred materials, to our own rather loud way of existing. We assume that any civilization would look enough like ours that we would recognize the outline immediately. What if that assumption is the first thing that fails? You know that feeling when you walk through an old place, a ruin or a deserted neighborhood, and the silence feels thicker than it should, as if the air remembers traffic, footsteps, voices, market cries, doors closing, things that are no longer there. I think deep time has that same feeling, except on a scale so much larger that we mostly protect ourselves by not looking directly at it. Because if we do look, really look, then the comforting story begins to loosen. The comforting story says that civilization began recently, that before us there was wilderness and instinct and slowly improving tools, that complexity climbed upward in a fairly neat line, and that we are simply the latest rung. It is a tidy story. Human beings love tidy stories. They help us sleep. But the earth is not tidy. It is layered, broken, melted, drowned, and reworked. Its memory is selective. Its archives are full of tears and missing pages. Imagine one of our own cities left alone, not for 1 year, not even for 1,000. Imagine 10,000 years. Rain enters first, patiently. It finds window frames, hairline cracks, little faults in the roof where no one patched the weakness because no one remained. Frost follows in colder places, widening what rain began. Metal swells red and breaks the stone around it. Vines reach through masonry and make leverage out of tenderness. Floors sag. Walls separate. Birds nest in upper rooms until upper rooms are no longer upper rooms, only heaps. Give it longer, and the streets blur. Give it longer still, and the map becomes wrong. Rivers alter course. Shorelines shift. A flood lays down a new blanket of silt. A landslide pulls half the hill across what used to be a district of apartments and small shops. Trees rise through the old intersections. Their roots move through kitchens and stairwells and foundations, lifting, twisting, making ruin into landscape. If you arrived much later, you might not see a city at all. You might see a low ridge, some odd stone concentrations, a change in soil chemistry, something suggestive and uncertain. Now multiply that by millions of years. The mind stumbles there, and maybe that is natural. Millions of years is enough time for mountain ranges to be born and ruined, enough time for shallow seas to settle over old valleys and retreat again, enough time for layers of sediment to bury what was once the surface, then harden, then crack, then be exposed again in a different climate under a different sky. Enough time for entire coastlines to be dragged beneath other plates and melted back into the interior of the world. So perhaps the real question is not, where are the ruins? Perhaps it is, why do we expect ruins at all? Somewhere in a laboratory, a geologist slices open a core sample taken from deep under the ocean floor. It is narrow, almost delicate, a long cylinder of ancient mud turned to record. Thin bands of color run through it like sleep stages, dark gray, lighter gray, an ash line, a shift in grain, a chemical whisper from some vanished event. If there were a lost civilization far enough back, maybe that is where its ghost would be now, not in grand architecture, but in a strange little disturbance, a sudden layer, an odd ratio of elements, a scar so small it could be mistaken for chance. If you were standing here with me beside the fire, I think this would be the moment I would lower my voice even more, because the idea is not loud anymore. It has become intimate, a missing chapter, not fantasy, not certainty, but a serious unease. The possibility that intelligence could bloom and disappear, and the planet would continue without ceremony, turning that life into sediment, into trace minerals, into one more faint irregularity in the dark. And I think that is what makes this question feel darker than it first appears. It does not flatter us. It does not promise that the universe carefully preserves everything important. It suggests the opposite. That importance is local. That meaning can be immense to those living it, and still leave almost nothing behind. That a whole world of thought and structure and striving might vanish so completely that the future never even knows what it lost. There is something almost tender in that. Too sad, yes, but tender. Because it means the earth is not cruel. It is simply busy. Busy making and unmaking forms. Busy carrying the long, slow weight of oceans and continents and climates. Busy turning certainty into dust and then into rock. Tonight we are not going to claim that another civilization definitely came before us. We are not going to leap into easy answers. We are going to do something more difficult and more honest. We are going to ask whether the planet would even let us know. Whether the evidence we dream of finding could survive the patient grinding machinery of deep time. Whether absence really means nothing was there, or only that the slate was wiped too clean. And once that question settles into you, another one follows close behind, soft as footsteps in the next room. If civilization can be so easily hidden by time, then what exactly counts as civilization in the first place? What kind of patterns should we even be looking for? A city, a script, a mine, a change in a river, a long memory held in the soil, a society without towers, a culture without metal, a species whose intelligence does not resemble ours closely enough for us to greet it as kin. The fire is lower now, and the room feels smaller, gentler. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, the planet keeps doing what it has always done, cooling, shifting, turning, carrying its old scars under forests and highways and sleeping towns. We sit on its skin and call ourselves modern. We say ancient when we mean a few thousand years. We say forgotten as if the world were careless. But maybe the world is not careless. Maybe the world is thorough. And if something lived here before us, learned here before us, built some quiet shape of complexity under a different moon and a different sky, then perhaps what remains of it is not a palace buried under stone. Perhaps it is only a question, a pressure in the mind, a strange silence in the record, a feeling that when we look into the deepest past of Earth, we are not looking into emptiness at all, only into a darkness where almost everything has already been gently, completely, and very patiently erased. And now, having let that thought settle, we can go one step closer. Because before we search for any forgotten predecessor, we need to know what kind of thing we would call a civilization if we found only its shadow. The next part of this question is quieter, but in some ways, even stranger. Before we can wonder whether another civilization rose here long ago, we have to ask what a civilization actually is. That sounds simple, almost too simple, but it matters more than it first appears. Because very often we are not searching for the past itself. We are searching for the version of the past that our own habits have taught us to notice. In ordinary conversation, civilization means certain familiar things. Cities, walls, roads, writing, rulers, fields laid out in regular lines, records, temples, perhaps some polished stone or a skyline standing against the sun. We imagine order made visible. We imagine density. We imagine people storing food and symbols and power. We imagine layers of labor pressed into durable form. And of course, those things do count. They count very much. But they are not the whole story. They are only the forms civilization took in some places. At some times, under some conditions, even in our own species, the pattern is not fixed. Human societies have arranged themselves in ways far more varied than the neat textbook sequence suggests. Some left massive stoneworks. Some left almost nothing but soil changes, seeds, paths, and burials. Some coordinated huge populations without writing. Some built ritual centers before they built cities. Some shaped whole landscapes without ever producing the kind of monuments that museums love. I have always found it strange that we trust skylines more than patterns. A wall convinces us. A road convinces us. A script on clay convinces us. But coordinated living over generations, shared ritual, planned use of space, memories stored in bodies and traditions instead of libraries. Those things can be just as profound and much harder to see. So let us widen the frame. In archaeology and anthropology, there are usual signs people look for when they speak of civilization. Urban centers, specialized labor, surplus food production, organized belief systems, long-distance trade, formal leadership, social layers, durable symbols, or writing. It is a useful list. But not every known civilization checks every box. And not every box has to look the same from one place to another. Some societies become complex through stone. Some through water management. Some through memory. Some through astonishing coordination that leaves only subtle marks. Picture an ancient settlement at dawn. No towers. No paved roads. Just low structures pressed close together. Mud walls still cool from the night. Roofs dark with old smoke. Small openings where morning light enters in thin, calm strips. Somewhere a grain is being ground. Somewhere a child wakes under woven fabric. Somewhere an elder touches a wall that their mother also touched, and her mother before that. The place may not look imperial. It may not impress a conqueror, but it holds continuity, shared forms, planned space, stored food, repeated ceremony, collective life stretched across generations. That, too, is civilization. One of the gentlest examples comes from a place called Chatalhoyuk in what is now Turkey. It is about 9,000 years old, and if you arrived there expecting broad avenues and public monuments, you would be puzzled. The houses were packed tightly together. People entered through openings in the roof. There were no obvious streets running between them. At first glance, it can feel almost improvised, almost modest. Yet it was not random. It was a settled world. Homes built shoulder to shoulder. Rituals repeated. Food prepared and stored. The dead buried beneath floors. Memory literally held inside domestic space. If you were standing there in the cool morning air, you would not need a palace to know this was a human order larger than any single family. You would feel it in the rhythms, in the way one roof led to another, in the slow smoke, in the clay, in the footsteps polished into the same surfaces over and over. Complexity does not always announce itself in grand architecture. Sometimes it sits quietly in repetition, and once you understand that, the question becomes much more difficult and much more interesting. Because if civilization can be subtle even in recent human history, what might it look like in a time far older than ours, or in a species not shaped by our instincts, our bodies, our materials, our preferences? What if a civilization did not prize stone? What if it never discovered metallurgy, or simply never needed it? What if it built with fibers, with wood, with resins, with things that cooperated with the environment instead of resisting it? What if its intelligence was social and ecological rather than monumental? What if it altered landscapes through planting, burning, channeling water, guiding animal migrations, tending coasts, breeding species, storing knowledge in performance and memory rather than in objects meant to outlast the body? Would we call that civilization if we found only its after effects? Or would we miss it because it never made a pyramid? Honestly, I think this is one of the deepest traps in the whole question. We imagine that intelligence must move toward our own visible style of development, toward harder materials, larger machines, more extraction, more permanence, more waste. But that may say more about us than about intelligence itself. A society could become very complex while remaining materially light. It could cultivate stability instead of expansion. It could choose traditions that vanish gracefully. It could become expert in the living world rather than in quarrying stone. From the inside, it might feel rich, wise, and highly organized. From a distance of millions of years, it might look like almost nothing. The same problem appears when we think about symbols, because writing is only one way of storing knowledge. Human beings used memory long before they used script. Songs carried maps. Ritual sequences carried calendars. Stories carried flood histories, hunting rules, lineages, boundaries, obligations, ethics. A spoken system can be extraordinarily sophisticated. It only becomes fragile when the chain is broken. One collapse, one migration, one plague, one long drought, one generation that cannot pass the pattern on. Then the archive is gone, not because it was crude, but because it was alive. If you were standing in a dark cave 50,000 years ago and watching someone press pigment to stone, you might not see civilization. You might see only a hand moving carefully in torchlight. But there, in that movement, is abstraction, planning, memory, shared meaning, and the desire to leave a sign that outlasts the breath. The earliest symbolic behavior of our own species tells us that minds were working in layered ways long before cities. Ochre with geometric engravings, shell beads drilled and strung, tools prepared through multiple steps. These are not the acts of simple creatures stumbling from one need to the next. These are beings arranging matter according to thought. So perhaps civilization is best understood not as a finish line, but as a spectrum of accumulated intentionality. A society becomes more civilizational as it coordinates more deeply across time, as it stores and shares knowledge, as it modifies the world in deliberate ways that outlast individuals, as it builds systems larger than a single body can carry alone. That kind of definition matters because it changes what we look for. We stop asking only for towers and start asking for patterns. Repetition where randomness would be expected. Long-term landscape shaping. anomalies in plant distribution, strange soil enrichment, deliberate geometry, coordinated animal management, recurrent use of the same place across generations, a local environment that seems not merely occupied, but curated. And once you begin thinking that way, the ordinary world becomes a little stranger. A hillside terrace may be agriculture or geology. A dark, fertile soil may be natural or engineered over centuries. A cluster of stones may be random fall, or the soft residue of structure after wood vanished. A shoreline might have been a route, a memory path, a sacred boundary, a market. The challenge is not simply finding things. It is learning to see intentionality in forms that do not shout. There is another complication, too. Intelligence itself may not come packaged the way ours does. We are tool users with grasping hands, language-heavy minds, and bodies that do many things badly but manipulate objects extremely well. It is no surprise that our civilization takes material form, but another intelligent species might organize through other strengths. Visual signaling, chemical communication, collective behavior, different senses, different body plans, different relationships to energy and landscape. If they coordinated at scale, stored knowledge, and altered ecosystems deliberately, would we recognize that as civilization or mistake it for a very intricate ecosystem? Think of a termite mound for a moment. Airflow managed, temperature regulated, internal organization maintained, fungus cultivated, labor coordinated without visible leaders. From the outside, a tower of earth. From the inside, a living architecture. Now imagine a form of intelligence that worked more like that, distributed, adaptive, embedded, creating order without the kinds of objects we instinctively classify as culture. The line between organism and civilization might blur. This is not to say that every interesting structure in nature is evidence of mind. Far from it. Nature makes patterns with almost embarrassing ease. Crystals, hives, branching rivers, basalt columns, dunes aligned by wind. All can look designed. The point is only that our categories are less secure than we pretend. We are used to seeing civilization in our own reflection. The deeper question asks whether we can recognize it in shadow. That is why the issue of evidence becomes so delicate. We may spend centuries looking for the wrong things, waiting for an unmistakable artifact, while the real clues lie elsewhere. In chemistry, in land use, in relationships between species, in the repeated quiet shaping of an environment over time. A civilization may leave less of a monument than a pattern, less of a palace than a pressure. There is a calm kind of sadness in that thought. The idea that entire worlds of organization could exist and vanish without giving us anything easy to hold. But there is wonder in it too. It means the Earth may have hosted forms of complexity richer than our narrow categories allow. It means that to ask whether someone came before us is not only to ask what survived. It is to ask whether our imagination is disciplined enough and flexible enough to notice kinds of presence we were never trained to expect. And now the fire has burned down to a softer orange, and the room feels very still. Let that stillness help us. because the next step is not dramatic. It is simply this. Once civilization is understood as pattern, continuity, intention, and world shaping, rather than only monument and metal, the real obstacle rises in front of us like a dark shoreline. Geology. Because even if another intelligence did emerge, and even if it became complex in ways we would recognize, it would still have had to live on a planet that erases surfaces. Rain, frost, sediment, plate motion, buried coastlines, melted seafloor, missing layers. The Earth does not merely hide old things. It works on them continuously until the distinction between made and unmade begins to blur. So the search becomes stranger still. We are not just asking, what is civilization? We are asking, what kind of civilization could survive long enough in evidence to be seen after the planet has been patiently editing it for millions of years? Maybe one built from stone and metal would still fail to leave more than a few cryptic disturbances. Maybe one built lightly, intelligently, almost in cooperation with the world, would disappear even more completely. Maybe our own categories are too blunt. Maybe our methods are too recent. Maybe the record is not empty, but subtle, and we have not yet learned how to read subtlety at planetary scale. That is where the road leads next. Away from definitions and toward the machinery of forgetting itself. Toward weathering, burial, pressure, drift, and heat. Toward the moving surface under every city and hill and field. Because before we can ask what survives of a civilization, we have to face the patient force that wears civilization down, atom by atom, until only the faintest trace remains, if anything remains at all. If you stay with the thought a little longer, you begin to feel the planet differently, not as scenery, not as a stage waiting patiently for life to build upon it, but as an active force, almost a vast, slow animal of pressure and heat. The ground under every town, every field, every coast is not still. It never was. It rises, cracks, settles, drowns, freezes, buckles, and slides. And that matters because any civilization, no matter how careful or brilliant, has to place itself on that moving skin. We are used to thinking in human scales. A wall that lasts 500 years feels durable. A stone temple surviving 3,000 years feels almost immortal. But geological time is ruthless to anything measured in centuries. Give rain enough seasons, and it will find the seam in any masonry. Give frost enough winters, and it will widen that seam patiently until the stone begins to split. Give roots enough darkness and moisture, and they will enter where water entered first, levering blocks apart with a force that feels almost thoughtful. Then there is the softer work. Dust settling, silt laid down by floods, sand drifting across abandoned surfaces, leaves falling and becoming soil, ash from distant eruptions descending in a fine gray veil over roofs and roads and courtyards. A forgotten structure is not only broken down, it is covered, pressed upon, folded into the next layer of the world. If you have ever seen an old path in a forest, one that should have vanished, but still survives as a shallow line where the ground dips very slightly, you know how strange persistence can be. Now, imagine the opposite. Imagine a place where even the path is gone, not overgrown, not hidden, but physically erased. Its stones carried off, its compacted earth loosened, its shape blended back into slope and hollow and runoff. That is what most of the earth does to surface history. Start with weathering, because it sounds gentle and is anything but. Weathering is the daily wearing down of exposed things by wind, water, temperature shifts, chemistry, and biological activity. It is common, ordinary, and therefore easy to underestimate. A cliff face looks solid because we catch it in one moment, but over longer spans it flakes, peels, fractures, and drains away into streams, grain by grain. Metal blooms into rust. Concrete cracks as water enters and expands with cold. Even glass clouds, pits, and breaks. Organic matter does not stand a chance. Cloth, leather, wood, rope, paper, bone. Almost all of it goes back into the cycle quickly, unless it is granted unusual mercy by dryness, cold, or sudden burial. And then burial itself arrives, quiet and transformative. Sediment is one of the great editors of history. It can preserve, yes, but preservation is never neutral. Sediment presses, distorts, compresses, and hides. A buried object may survive chemically while losing its meaning entirely. A house may collapse inward and become an odd stain in the ground. A hearth may become only a dark patch rich in charcoal and phosphorus. A wooden post may disappear so completely that all that remains is a post hole, a circular ghost in the soil, visible only to a careful eye trained to read absence. I have always loved that phrase, a post hole, because it is almost absurdly modest. Not the post, not the wall, only the vacancy left by something once necessary. Archaeology so often works like that. It reconstructs rooms from stains, meals from seeds, rituals from fragments of bone and pigment. And that is within 10,000 years, within the very recent past. Stretch the interval to millions of years, and even those modest traces become precious to the point of impossibility. There is another force that feels more dramatic because it is harder to ignore. Tectonics. The outer shell of the Earth is broken into plates, and those plates are always moving, though so slowly that a single lifetime barely notices. But over enough time, the movement becomes overwhelming. Plates collide and lift mountains. Plates pull apart and open seas. Plates slide past one another and fracture whole regions. Most importantly for our question, plates also carry crust downward into the mantle through subduction. Seafloor does not last forever. It is made, moved, and eventually consumed. This means something quietly devastating. Any ancient civilization that lived near coasts, on islands, or on terrain that later became seafloor might not merely be hidden. It might be gone in the most complete sense available on this planet. Melted, remixed, absorbed into the interior. There would be no ruin to find, because the stage itself would have been taken apart. The average age of the ocean floor is astonishingly young compared with the age of the Earth. Much of it has been recycled within a few 100 million years. That sounds ancient until you remember how old the planet really is. Whole chapters of surface history have been pulled down and erased many times over. if anything intelligent lived on coasts in a very remote age. And coastal living is the thing many intelligent beings might choose, because coasts are rich and moderate and connected. Then the places most likely to have held their settlements are also the places least likely to preserve them for us. And coastlines do not need deep time to betray their inhabitants. Even within our own species, they are unstable companions. Sea levels rise and fall. Storm surges rearrange barrier islands and estuaries. River mouths wander. Tsunamis rewrite shorelines in an afternoon. During the last ice age, sea level was dramatically lower, exposing huge areas of continental shelf that are now submerged. Entire landscapes that would once have been inviting to human settlement, estuaries, low river valleys, fishing grounds, mild coasts, now sleep under water and sediment. If you were standing beside one of those old coastlines 12,000 years ago, you would not know it as a future seabed. You would know it as home. You would know where the shellfish beds were, where the freshwater spring emerged close to the dunes, where canoes or rafts were pulled onto the sand, where people met at dusk with baskets and nets. Then the water would rise over generations. Not dramatic at first. Easy to deny, perhaps. A little more salt in the marsh. A place where children once played, now muddy at high tide. A shrine moved inland. A path abandoned. A village shifted. The old coastline lost. And with each retreat, some piece of continuity gone with it. Multiply that process across the world, and it becomes easy to see how much history may lie drowned. Not fantastical kingdoms with crystal palaces, just real inhabited landscapes, ordinary and precious, carrying the earliest stable patterns of social life. They are difficult enough for us to investigate now, and those are only late prehistoric examples. Go much deeper into time, and the odds narrow sharply. Mountains, too, are less trustworthy than they look. They feel eternal because they dominate human sight, but mountains are transient structures in the life of a planet. They rise through compression and uplift, then begin wearing down immediately. Rain cuts them. Rivers carry them away. Glaciers carve them into bowls and ridges. Freeze and thaw shatter their faces. In enough time, a mountain range can become rolling ground, then basin, then sea, then mountain range again somewhere else by other means. If an ancient civilization built among highlands, later, geologists might find only distorted metamorphic rock, the original surfaces long stripped away. Volcanoes add another kind of uncertainty. They can destroy instantly and preserve accidentally. Ash may bury landscapes fast enough to keep them, at least for a while, in suspended memory. Lava may seal older surfaces. But volcanic regions are also chemically active, thermally unstable, often later reworked by erosion and tectonics. A city under ash might become a rare gift to archaeologists. Or it might be crushed, heated, altered, and folded into a more general confusion. When you begin adding these processes together, weathering, erosion, burial, uplift, subduction, glaciation, volcanism, sea level change, the idea of a durable surface archive becomes almost quaint. The surprise is not that so much is missing. The surprise is that anything at all survives. Think of the fossil record. People often picture a parade of complete skeletons arranged in time, each species stepping neatly into the next. But real fossils are sparse, accidental, and selective. Most organisms never fossilize. Most bodies are eaten, scattered, dissolved, or rotted before mineral replacement ever has a chance. To become a fossil, you need unusual conditions: rapid burial, protection, chemistry that favors preservation. And then that fossil has to survive everything that comes afterward and be exposed at just the right time for someone to notice it. If even bodies have such poor odds, what chance does a woven wall have? What chance does a leather binding, a wooden machine, a paper archive, a spoken language? This is why the search for earlier civilization cannot depend on traditional ruins alone. We are unlikely to be handed anything so generous. The traces, if any remain, would probably be indirect. A chemical disturbance in sediment, an odd concentration of certain elements, a pattern of landscape modification, a cluster of manufactured-looking fragments in a place where nature should have produced only randomness, a fossil assemblage showing abrupt ecological change, a thin layer in the rock where the slow pulse of the planet seems suddenly interrupted. But even those clues are difficult, because nature itself is capable of violence and anomaly. Volcanoes leave chemical signatures. Asteroid impacts leave iridium. Methane releases alter carbon ratios. Ocean anoxia can kill ecosystems on a large scale. It is not enough to find something strange. You have to find something strange that resists all the usual explanations. And that is a very high bar. If you were standing in a geology lab late at night, with only the hum of refrigeration and the glow of instruments, and you held a sediment core split lengthwise under clean light, you might see nothing remarkable at first. Brown layers, gray layers, flecks of shell, tiny changes in texture. Yet to a trained eye, each shift says something. Warmer water, more oxygen, less oxygen, a doustier climate, a plankton bloom, ash from a far volcano, time made visible by thin differences. Somewhere in such records, perhaps, there could be signs of intelligent activity, but they would not announce themselves in plain language. They would sit among natural events, whispering in ratios and residues. This is where humility becomes necessary. We cannot simply say, "We have not found them, therefore, they were never there." The Earth is too dynamic for that confidence. At the same time, we cannot say, "Things are missing, therefore a lost civilization must have existed." The missingness of the record proves only that the record is fragile. It invites possibility, not certainty. And yet that invitation matters, because it changes the emotional center of the question. The question stops being a treasure hunt for impossible artifacts and becomes something more serious, more scientific, and maybe more haunting. It becomes an inquiry into preservation bias, into the physics of forgetting, into the mismatch between how long civilizations may last from the inside and how little survives of them from the outside. I think that is why this subject feels so restful and unsettling at the same time. It shrinks us, but gently. It reminds us that permanence is mostly a story living creatures tell themselves. The Earth tells a different story. In the Earth story, even the mighty are temporary. Even the loud becomes sediment. Even a species clever enough to ask where the others went may someday be only a small chemical event in rock. For now, though, let us stay with the trace, the faintness, the almost impossible task of detection. Because once geology has done its slow work, once the obvious has been broken down and the surfaces have turned over, we are left with only the most stubborn remnants. And those remnants are rarely bones or walls. More often they are subtler things. Chemistry. Ratius. Tiny anomalies that do not look like memory until someone reads them that way. That is where we go next. Into fossils. Into preservation. Into the strange fact that even the best record of ancient life is mostly a silence filled in by luck. And if the fossil record itself is so incomplete, then whatever lies beyond it, whatever intelligence or near intelligence or complexity might once have existed, may be hiding, not because it was grand, but because almost everything grand eventually becomes unremarkable when enough pressure and time have had their turn. When people imagine the deep past, they often imagine bones. A great jaw in stone. A curved tooth. The long lifted neck of some vanished animal mounted under museum lights. Fossils give us confidence because they feel tangible. They feel like proof you could touch. But the fossil record is not a catalog of everything that ever lived. It is a selective whisper, a collection of improbable survivals, and its silences are as important as its finds. Most living things disappear without leaving any fossil at all. That is not failure. It is simply the normal outcome. A body dies. Soft tissue collapses. Scavengers arrive. Bacteria work quickly. Sun and water and friction take over. To become a fossil, an organism usually needs to be buried fast enough to escape ordinary decay, protected long enough for mineral replacement or compression to occur, and fortunate enough to remain in a geological setting that will not later crush, melt, or erode the result. After all that, the fossil still has to be exposed and found by some future eye. It is almost absurd. When you think about it, we build entire pictures of ancient life from a record that is mostly the exception to the rule. If that is true for bodies, then what must it be like for culture? For tools made of wood, for woven shelters, for stored food, for medicine wrapped in leaves, for pigments on bark, for memory systems spoken and sung, for objects deliberately made light because a mobile or ecologically careful society had no wish to carve itself into mountain stone. Those things would vanish even faster than flesh. This is why the fossil record can make the past look simpler than it really was. It preserves what resists decay, not necessarily what mattered most. Shells, teeth, dense bone, pollen, charcoal, a few robust mineralized structures, entire worlds of behavior and symbol and social form can be absent even when life itself was rich. We can know a species existed and still know almost nothing of what it was like to be among them. Take our own lineage. There were humans and near humans whose minds were doing remarkable things long before cities. They made tools, crossed landscapes, used pigments, perhaps told stories, cared for the injured, remembered paths, seasons, and stars. Yet most of what they thought and taught is gone. We infer. We reconstruct. We lean close to fragments and try to hear the whole choir from one surviving note. You know that feeling when someone leaves a room and their warmth is still faintly present in the chair. Fossils are like that. Evidence that something once occupied the space. Not the thing itself. Not its voice. Only proof that it pressed briefly against the world hard enough to register. Now imagine trying to detect not merely a species, but a civilization through such a medium. If a highly organized society existed millions of years ago, the chances of finding its direct fossil signature would depend on what kind of bodies it had, where it lived, and how it handled its dead. A species that cremated or exposed its dead would leave less. A species living in humid forests or on active coasts would leave less. A species with low population density but high coordination would leave less. A civilization does not become more detectable simply because it is intelligent. In some cases, intelligence may make it less detectable, especially if it manages waste efficiently, uses biodegradable materials, or chooses forms of infrastructure that cooperate with local ecosystems rather than resisting them. There is something almost comic in that. The more elegantly a society lives, the less it may survive in the archive. And there is a darker twist. Even if a civilization altered the world enough to leave a signal, that signal might not look cultural when we find it. It might look geological. A sudden carbon shift. An unusual distribution of rare elements. A change in sedimentation patterns. An abrupt reduction in biodiversity. Such things already appear in the history of the planet for natural reasons. Volcanic episodes, methane releases, ocean anoxia, impacts, climate shocks. The Earth has its own disasters and its own chemistry of upheaval. So the challenge is not merely to find a signal. It is to distinguish one sort of disturbance from another. To say, this layer records not just catastrophe, but agency. That is an extraordinary demand. Science does not make such claims lightly, and it should not. There is wisdom in caution. But caution can also make the absence of evidence appear more absolute than it really is. Because once you understand how rarely fossils form and how selectively materials survive, the silence of the deep past begins to sound less like proof of emptiness and more like a condition of the medium itself. In recent years, scientists have become increasingly aware that even our own civilization is writing itself into the geological record, not mainly through architecture, but through chemistry. Carbon isotopes shifted by fossil fuel combustion. Nitrogen cycles warped by fertilizer. Plastics and synthetic compounds carried into marine sediments. Radioactive residues from nuclear testing. Novel materials. Technofossils. Minerals formed through industrial processes. If some distant researcher examined our present after enough time had passed, they might never find a library or bridge, but they might find a very sharp line in sediment, a planetary disturbance compressed into a narrow band. This thought is both comforting and eerie. Comforting because it suggests intelligence can leave a mark. Eerie because the mark may be so impersonal. Not our poems, not our names, only our effect. That realization led some scientists to a playful but serious thought experiment. If our own industrial phase would eventually register only as a geochemical disturbance, Then could some older disturbance in Earth history have a similar source? Not necessarily humans. Not even necessarily a civilization exactly like ours. Just some form of organized industry or planetary scale activity that had happened long ago and then vanished. This line of inquiry does not prove anything. It merely sharpens the question. It asks what kinds of traces survive after millions of years, and whether we have mistaken all ancient anomalies for natural causes, because natural causes are the only ones we allow ourselves to consider first. Usually that conservative instinct is correct. Volcanoes are common. Impacts happen. Climate swings happen. But the exercise matters because it teaches us how to think about detectability rather than fantasy. What would survive longest? Stable isotopic shifts. Some synthetic molecules in highly unusual preservation conditions. Certain transuranic signatures, if the civilization used nuclear processes. Unnatural concentrations of rare metals tied to refined extraction. Abrupt biodiversity loss linked with resource use. Sediment layers carrying the residue of global manufacture. But every one of those possibilities comes with a problem. Nature can imitate parts of the pattern. Volcanism can raise carbon. Hydrothermal systems can concentrate metals. Ocean stagnation can alter ecosystems. The farther back you go, the harder it becomes to separate signal from noise. Deep time scrambles the scene and removes the labels. And labels matter. Without them, interpretation drifts. A future geologist might find a peculiar thin layer from our own century and classify it as a rapid climate event with unusual synthetic organics, no more personal than an ash band from a super eruption. That may be all we become in stone. I think this is where the question grows beautifully sad. We long to be remembered in our own shape, but the planet remembers mostly in translation. It translates bodies into mineral. It translates fire into carbon. It translates industry into chemistry. It translates social life into pollen changes and extinctions and moved sediments. In the end, perhaps civilization is legible only as disturbance. If that is true, then any earlier civilization would probably not greet us with statues. It would greet us with anomalies, with patterns that make geologists pause. A layer not entirely at home in its surroundings. A set of shifts arriving too sharply together. A residue that feels almost like intention, and yet cannot be claimed as such without stronger proof. The record would not say, "Here they lived." It would say, "Here something happened." And maybe that is enough to keep the question open. Fossils also teach another lesson. One people sometimes resist because it unsettles the comforting story of progress. Evolution is full of experiments. Branch, convergence, parallel solutions, and extinctions. Intelligence, too, may have gradients we are too narrow to notice. A species need not have reached our exact style of abstraction to have formed collective worlds of surprising depth. Tool use, social teaching, symbolic behavior, environmental management, long life, emotional bonds, cooperative care, all can occur without anything we would call industry. Those forms of complexity may leave even less of a trace than a metalworking culture, but they remind us that intelligence is not a switch that flips directly into cities. And because of that, the line between advanced behavior and civilization may blur in the remote past. A deeply social species might shape a region for millennia without ever creating the kinds of artifacts that fossilize well. Their legacy might exist in plant distributions, in managed fire regimes, in altered prey populations, in path networks compacted and reworked beyond recognition. Such effects are hard enough to detect within recent prehistory. Over millions of years, they fade almost completely. There are places where preservation is kinder. Ice, peat bows, anoxic lake beds, caves sealed by collapse. In those environments, the past can survive with a tenderness that feels miraculous. Hair, skin, woven fibers, footprints, seeds, baskets, even stomach contents. But these are rare windows, not the rule. We cannot build a whole planetary theory from a few generous environments. Most of Earth is not generous. And then there is sheer sampling. We have excavated only a tiny fraction of the places where traces might exist. This is true for recent human archaeology, and even more true for paleontology. Vast regions are unexplored or underexplored. Others are inaccessible. Others lie under modern cities, deserts, forests, or sea. We are reconstructing the past from a minute subset of what once existed. Every conclusion must be held with that knowledge in mind. If you were standing with me now, in the dim light, I would probably place a fossil in your hand if I had one. Something small, a shell perhaps, turned to stone. You would feel how light it is, how ordinary, how easy it would be to overlook if it were still embedded in rock. And then I would ask you to imagine how much had to happen for that one thing to survive, and how much else from its world did not. Whole reefs gone, whole storms gone, whole food webs gone, whole behaviors unrecorded. One shell remains, and we call it evidence. It is evidence, yes, but also a warning about how little of any world becomes durable enough to meet the future. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a more patient, more careful version of wonder. Not the loud wonder of hidden empires waiting to be discovered whole, but the quieter wonder of recognizing how selective the archive is. It leaves us prepared to look for traces in the wrong-seeming places, in chemistry, in disturbed layers, in ecological oddities, in the faint residue of organized activity. It leaves us willing to accept that the fossil record may hold the outline of more than we can currently name. And it leads naturally to the next step. If preservation is this poor, if fossils are this accidental, if bodies themselves barely survive the journey into deep time, then what of materials shaped by intelligence? What of tools, structures, synthetic compounds, industrial residues? What kinds of signatures could persist after the rest had gone? What would remain stubborn enough to resist weather, pressure, and forgetting long enough for us to find it and whisper? Perhaps not proof, not yet, but something like a question that has finally learned how to take form. For now, though, rest in the incompleteness of it. Let it calm you rather than trouble you. The earth has not hidden the past out of spite. It has only continued being earth, layering and lifting, preserving here, erasing there, keeping a few fragments and letting the rest dissolve into its patient dark. And if some earlier intelligence once moved across this world, if it ever pressed its thoughts into matter strongly enough to leave a mark, then the fossil record may not reveal its face. But somewhere, perhaps, it may still hold the faint pressure of its hand. If the deepest traces of a forgotten civilization would not survive as towers or roads, then perhaps they would remain as something thinner, stranger, and harder to love at first glance. A film in the rock, a change in chemistry, a line in a core sample that tells no story by itself, yet refuses to sit quietly among the natural rhythms around it. This is where the question becomes almost tender. We stop asking what they built and begin asking what they changed. Think of a scientist splitting open a long cylinder of ancient sediment in a cold laboratory. The room is quiet, except for the soft mechanical hum of refrigeration and filtered air. The sample has come up from deep ocean mud, or an old lake bed, or some polar archive where time settles in layers instead of rushing away. At first, there is almost nothing to impress the eye. Pale bands, darker bands, tiny grains, faint smears of shell, dust, ash. It looks humble. It looks like silence. Yet every band is a season piled on another season. An age laid gently over an age. In that narrow column of earth, there may be drought, flood, heat, cold, wildfire, bloom, extinction, recovery. The whole planet breathing in slow mineral pulses. Now imagine that somewhere in those layers sits a disturbance caused not by volcanoes, not by orbital shifts, not by an asteroid, but by minds. Not necessarily minds like ours, and not necessarily a civilization of steel and smoke and engines. Just a society coordinated enough, energetic enough, or expansive enough to alter the chemistry of its world. Could that survive? Could it still be there? Honestly, this is where the subject becomes most serious to me, because chemistry does not care about myths. Chemistry does not flatter us. If intelligence reshapes a planet, the first durable clue may not be a monument at all. It may be an isotope ratio shifted just enough to puzzle future scientists. Carbon is one of the clearest examples. When a civilization burns enormous stores of ancient carbon, whether coal, oil, gas, peat, or some unknown equivalent, it can change the relative abundance of carbon isotopes in the atmosphere and oceans. That shift can then settle into plants, shells, sediments, and ice, becoming part of the archive. Our own species is doing this now. The mark is real. It is measurable. Long after roads crack and towers collapse, there may still remain in rock a signal that the carbon cycle was violently disturbed in a very narrow span of time. So the question follows naturally. Have there been such disturbances before? Narrow global pulses in the geologic record that resemble industrial forcing. There have been strange events. Yes. Sudden warming episodes. Ocean acidification. Rapid ecological turnover. And most of them have convincing natural explanations. Massive volcanism. Methane release. Tectonic change. But even when the explanation seems likely, the pattern can look uncannily familiar. One famous example is the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Around 56 million years ago, temperatures rose sharply. Oceans changed. Carbon isotopes shifted. Life was stressed. Species moved or disappeared. To geologists, it is a natural event. Extraordinary, but not supernatural. And there is no good evidence that a civilization caused it. Still, when scientists compare that ancient warming with our own present disturbance, the resemblance is unsettling enough that it inspires thought experiments. If our industrial age will one day look like a thin, strange carbon pulse, then what is the difference between an industrial pulse and a natural one when both are old enough to lose their context? That context is everything. Without it, even a true signal could be filed away under catastrophe of unknown origin. A civilization might leave behind not a name but a misclassification. Then there are synthetic compounds. Our world is saturated with substances the planet did not invent by itself. Plastics, pesticides, industrial fluorinated chemicals, complex polymers, pigments and residues and molecular chains born in factories and reactors. Some of them decay quickly. Some fragment. Some linger in dark places, trapped in anoxic mud, embedded in landfill, locked in marine sediment, riding currents into abyssal plains. Future geology may not preserve a perfect bottle or a recognizable bag, but it may preserve the chemical ghost of those things. A peculiar concentration of long-chain molecules, an unexpected plastic-rich horizon, particles so unnatural in distribution that they would force a second look. Now widen that possibility. Suppose some earlier civilization made substances equally strange for its own purposes. Not our plastics, perhaps. Not our chemistry at all. Yet if those substances were sufficiently stable and sufficiently widespread, might they endure as a puzzle in rock? It is possible, in principle. That phrase matters. In principle, because possibility is not proof. But it opens a door. Metals offer another line of thought. Though they are less comforting than people expect, we like to think metal is durable because a bronze blade outlives the hand that held it. Yet over deep time, most metals corrode, disperse, oxidize, and become geochemical background unless preserved in unusual conditions. Iron rusts and blooms outward into softness. Copper greens, pits, and breaks. Aluminum survives better in some environments, poorly in others. Stainless alloys hold for a while, not forever. Even our proudest machine parts are temporary against groundwater, salt, pressure, and heat. And yet large-scale metal extraction can leave traces not as objects, but as concentrations. Mining disturbs landscapes. Smelting redistributes elements. Waste piles enrich soil and water with signatures that natural weathering may mimic only imperfectly. Lead, cadmium, chromium, rare earth elements, strange alloy ratios. These could, in theory, survive long after the tools themselves are gone. A future researcher might not find the device, only the wound where matter was pulled from one place, refined, and spread unnaturally through another. You know that feeling when you walk through an old industrial district and the ground seems to have a memory in it, a reddish stain, a glitter of slag, a smell that rain pulls back out of the soil. Scale that feeling upward into geologic time, and you begin to see how civilization might persist as contamination rather than architecture. A harsh word, contamination, but perhaps accurate. To act at scale is to leave waste. Radioactivity deepens the thought. Certain isotopes produced by nuclear activity do not occur naturally in meaningful abundance. Some decay quickly and would vanish from deep time. Others last longer, though not forever. Their existence in a future sediment layer could announce a brief and unnatural event if they were preserved in the right matrix. Our own nuclear age has already planted such seeds. A very thin horizon, global in reach, tied to weapons tests and reactor byproducts, may someday be one of the clearest fingerprints that something technological happened here. But it will not speak warmly. It will not explain itself. It will only say the background changed abruptly, and then changed again. A civilization might also leave mineral evidence. This idea sounds dry until you realize how strange it is. Human industry is already creating minerals unknown in untouched nature. Compounds born in landfills, smelters, concrete, wiring, fly ash, electronics, ceramics, pigments, and pressure-treated structures. These materials are not magical. They are simply matter rearranged into forms the Earth would be unlikely to produce on its own in such combinations. Millions of years from now, some of them may still remain as odd inclusions in rock. Not cities. Not machines. Tiny, stubborn signatures of fabrication. There is a sadness in that. That mind's capable of music, grief, tenderness, cruelty, mathematics, and wonder may eventually register only as a slight mineral strangeness in stone. Yet maybe that sadness is useful. It makes us think more carefully about what a prior civilization would actually look like once reduced to the scale the Earth prefers. It would not look cinematic. It would look statistical. It would be a pattern emerging only after enough data were laid side by side. This is why the search, if one can call it that, belongs more to geochemistry than treasure hunting. The relevant question is not where is the buried palace. It is whether ancient rocks contain combinations of signals that are easier to understand as organized planetary activity than as ordinary catastrophe. A fast carbon pulse, simultaneous ecological disruption, unexplained synthetic residues, unusual metal distributions, perhaps all compressed into one brief interval. Even then, caution would remain necessary. Nature is inventive. Nature is messy. Nature can imitate intention surprisingly well when seen from far enough away. And then there is the ocean, patient devourer of evidence. We touched on it before, but here its role becomes sharper. The oceans collect fallout. They store particles. They settle stories into mud. If a civilization dumped waste, altered atmospheric chemistry, or transformed nutrient cycles, the sea would catch part of that signal, layer after layer, basin after basin. It would record the changed world as a change in itself. A future core sample might show a moment when plankton communities shifted suddenly, when oxygen dropped, when a peculiar distribution of elements spread widely and then faded. Such clues may already exist in ancient events that geologists explain naturally. And usually those explanations are probably right. But the framework matters, because it teaches us what kind of residue thought and industry would have if stripped of all romance. I have always found it strange that people assume a lost civilization, if it existed, must have wanted to be remembered. Maybe memory is not guaranteed even when sought. Maybe it is especially not guaranteed. A grand culture might erect monuments and still fail to survive in the record if those monuments stood in the wrong latitude, on the wrong crust, near the wrong coast, under the wrong climate. Another culture might leave no monuments at all yet, stamp the atmosphere so sharply that its brief existence remains visible long after every stone has turned anonymous. The durable thing may not be what the civilization valued most. It may be what it could not help leaving behind. That thought brings the whole question closer to home. What are we leaving that we did not mean to leave? The carbon, certainly. The plastics, the extinctions, the isotopes, the altered nitrogen cycle, the concrete dust, the technofossils in landfill and estuary and delta. If future beings ever ask whether someone came before them, those are the clues we are preparing for them. Not our best self, not our songs, not the warmth of kitchens or the private courage of ordinary people, only the deep residue of our scale. And maybe that is the final test. If we want to know whether a previous civilization could be found, we need only ask how we ourselves would appear after enough erasure. Thin chemical violence in the record, a brief pulse of extraction, a sudden acceleration of change, a strange layer, then quiet again. So let the image settle. A line in ancient stone, perhaps unnoticed at first. A little too much carbon, a little too little biodiversity, unexpected compounds in dark sediment. Tiny signs, none of them dramatic, but together almost enough to suggest that once, for a brief interval, the planet passed through the hands of intelligence and was changed by it. Not forever, never forever. Just enough that the rock remembered. There is one more gentle complication. A civilization might not alter the whole planet evenly. It might flare in one basin, one chain of coasts, one fertile inland sea, and vanish before its chemistry spread worldwide. In that case, the signal would be local, easier to miss, easier to bury under later rivers and deltas and volcanic dust. A single strange lake core, a single estuary with an anomalous layer, a single buried shelf full of clues no one has yet sampled. The Earth is large enough to hide small brilliance for a very long time. From here, the path leads naturally toward comparison, toward our own vanishing, and what would remain of us if the Earth were given time to work without interruption. Because the best way to imagine a prior civilization is to imagine our own already reduced, already translated, already stripped of voice and shape, until only the longest-lived clues remain. And once you do that, the whole mystery becomes less about fantasy and more about a quiet scientific grief. The grief of knowing how easily thought can become only chemistry. If all at once the human world went silent, not exploded, not burned in one final dramatic gesture, but simply stopped, the Earth would not pause to mourn. It would continue. Dawn would still move over glass towers. Tides would still fold themselves against ports and seawalls. Rain would still enter gutters, stairwells, tunnels, roofs. At first, the world would look almost intact, like a stage after actors have slipped away between scenes. But maintenance is a form of life, and without it, even our strongest works begin to loosen very quickly. Within hours, power grids would stagger. Some places would go dark at once. Others would remain lit briefly by momentum, by automation, by stored pressure, by backup systems waiting for instructions that never come. Water treatment plants would falter. Pumps would fail. Subway tunnels would begin to gather water. Elevators would stop. Refrigeration would end. In the first days, there would still be an eerie order to things. Parked cars, quiet airports, crosswalks blinking for no one. Then weather and biology would begin their patient takeover. It is almost soothing to picture, in a strange way. Not because disappearance is soothing, but because nature is so immediate in its response. Seeds are always waiting. Roots are always pushing. Moss does not need permission. Vines do not hesitate. In a single spring, cracks in pavement would darken green. In a decade, saplings would rise in parking lots and on rooftops where soil had slowly gathered from dust, leaves, and bird droppings. Foxes, deer, feral dogs, boar, whatever the region allows, would begin wandering through the softened edges of our absence. And the buildings, those proud vertical declarations, would prove how dependent they always were on attention. Glass would break with storms, thermal stress, minor impacts, corrosion in fittings. Water would enter. Steel hidden in reinforced concrete would rust and swell, splitting the surrounding mass from within. Roof membranes would fail. Timber would rot where dampness settled. In colder climates, freeze and thaw would pry open every weakness. In warmer, wetter climates, mold, insects, and root systems would move in with astonishing speed. The fall would not happen all at once, but it would happen. A century later, many neighborhoods would still be recognizable from above. Roads faintly visible. Bridge spans perhaps still standing in dry regions. The skeletons of towers in a few protected downtowns. But the interiors would be gone. Floors fallen. Cables stripped by corrosion. Walls peeled. Ceilings collapsed into black mold and debris. Another century. More settling. Another few. And whole districts would be reduced to low mounds under trees and invasive shrubs. Cities in humid climates would disappear faster than people imagine. Desert cities might linger longer in outline, yet wind and salt and thermal shock would still work steadily at them. This matters because it gives us a scale for survivability. Our civilization feels massive from within. But from the perspective of deep time, it is thin, fragile, and poorly anchored. Most of what we build is designed for decades, not for epochs. Even our archival instincts are short-term. Magnetic media loses coherence. Hard drives fail. Servers fall silent the instant cooling and power disappear. Optical media clouds and delaminates. Flash memory cannot hold charge forever. Paper burns, molds, and decays. Film shrinks. leather cracks. The extraordinary volume of information we produce might, in the long run, prove less durable than a clay tablet. If you were standing in a future excavation trench 10,000 years after us, what would you find? Not the internet, not the music, not the conversations, not the quiet bravery of unknown people. You might find shards of ceramic, altered soil chemistry, strange alloys in corroded masses, glass beads, concrete rubble, a layer rich in plastics and combustion byproducts, perhaps a sealed chamber somewhere lucky enough to have remained dry. That would already be an exceptional survival. Stretch the interval much further, 100,000 years, 1,000,000, and the reduction becomes severe. Surface structures would be gone almost everywhere. Coastlines would likely have shifted. Some cities would lie under new sediment. Others would have been eroded away. Glaciation, if another strong cycle came, could grind entire regions clean, scraping away not just walls, but soils and roadbeds and graveyards alike. Tectonics would begin to matter more. Volcanic burial, river migration, marine transgression, basin subsidence, all would sort and scramble the remains. And yet something of us would persist, not in shape, but in signature. This is the crucial point. The more you imagine our own reduction, the easier it becomes to understand how a previous civilization might survive only as planetary disturbance. We are already altering the carbon cycle so dramatically that future geologists will see it. We are already spreading synthetic particles into ocean mud and polar snow. We are already redistributing nitrogen, phosphorus, heavy metals, and rare compounds through every major Earth system. We are already driving extinctions fast enough to register as a biotic event. Those things are not subjective. They are geological. A future scientist might know nothing of our languages and still conclude that a brief interval of intense organized activity occurred, not because our monuments survived, but because the planet itself was pushed out of its previous balance. This is where the whole mystery of earlier civilizations becomes unsettlingly intimate. The best model for what one would look like is us, reduced. And reduced us is mostly chemistry. Picture a sediment core 1,000,000 years after our disappearance. A narrow band where pollen suddenly changes because forests fell and agriculture spread. A carbon isotope shift from fossil fuel combustion. A wave of plastics broken into microscopic particles and trapped in marine deposits. A thin scatter of radionuclides. A strange cluster of industrially produced minerals. Then above it, perhaps, recovery. New ecosystems. New weather patterns. New normal. The signal would remain, but its makers would be absent. Someone reading that layer might argue over its cause. Rapid volcanism, unusual methane release, extraordinary climate feedback, or perhaps, if they are imaginative and disciplined enough, industrial civilization. But they would not know us. They would know only that something brief and powerful happened. I have always found that almost unbearably beautiful. The idea that our grand self-image might narrow into one sharp line in stone. Not because it humiliates us, but because it places us correctly. We are significant. Yes, but not exempt from translation. The Earth keeps records in its own language, and it does not promise fidelity to our preferred meanings. So, if some other civilization once existed, some earlier experiment in intelligence, then asking where are their cities may be the wrong question. The better question is, where is their line? Where in the rock does the planet remember passing through their influence? Was it a carbon disturbance? A pulse of warming? A sudden sedimentary anomaly? A brief bloom of strange compounds? A subtle mineral horizon nobody has thought to reinterpret because there was no reason until recently to ask whether intelligence could have come before. There is a phrase I keep circling back to. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. People use it too casually, but here it has real force if handled honestly. It does not mean a hidden civilization probably existed. It means only that when preservation is this poor and detectability this dependent on luck, silence cannot close the case. Silence may simply be what deep time usually sounds like. Still, not all silence is empty. Sometimes it is structured. Sometimes it is a pause around an anomaly not yet understood. Consider how often science has had to revise its confidence. We once had no idea that Denisovans existed until a fragment of bone and the right genetic tools revealed an entire branch of human reality. We once assumed monumental building required agriculture until Göbekli Tepe stood up out of the hill and made that assumption look naive. We once missed whole cities beneath forest canopies until LiDAR taught us how to see through leaves. We once misread many environmental transformations as natural until careful study revealed human shaping hidden in soil and pollen and charcoal. This does not prove that a very ancient civilization awaits discovery, but it warns us against the arrogance of complete narratives. Our models are always provisional, always balanced on available evidence, always vulnerable to the next tool, the next excavation, the next core, the next anomaly that refuses to fit. You know that feeling when a story changes not because someone lied to you, but because a missing page is finally found. That is how science moves when it is healthy. It does not cling to neatness. It revives, it breathes. It learns to live with uncertainty and then push gently into it. The thought experiment of our own disappearance also raises another, more intimate question. What parts of civilization matter if almost none of them endure? Is permanence the measure of significance? Surely not. Most of what is valuable in any society is transient by nature. Care, conversation, song, learning, grief, shared meals, quiet acts of duty. Children taught how to notice weather, how to mend, how to ask, how to tell the truth. These things are civilization too, even if they leave no direct geologic signature. Perhaps any earlier intelligence, if it existed, also spent most of its meaningful life in such ephemeral forms, in moments and customs the Earth would never keep. That possibility softens the question. We stop looking only for giant evidence and begin to accept that a lost civilization may be lost, not because it failed to become grand, but because grandeur is simply not the part that survives best. And yet, the practical side remains. What would endure? Carbon shifts, technofossils, biodiversity collapse, synthetic residues, isotopic oddities, the planetary fingerprints of extraction and combustion and scale. If they had those, if they industrialized, if they altered their world broadly, if not, then perhaps almost nothing. Perhaps they lived cleverly and left lightly. Perhaps they knew how to cooperate with ecosystems better than we do. Perhaps they stayed regional and cyclical. Perhaps they flourished for long ages and vanished almost without scar. That kind of civilization would be nearly impossible to recover. There is something humbling in every branch of the answer. If they were heavy and expansive, time may have thinned them into chemistry. If they were elegant and restrained, time may have erased them almost completely. Either way, our confidence should soften. So where does this leave us tonight? Here at the edge of the question. It leaves us with a planet that forgets aggressively but not perfectly. It leaves us with the knowledge that our own civilization is preparing exactly the sort of residue from which future beings might infer our existence. It leaves us with no proof that anyone came before, and no solid reason to declare that nobody could have. It leaves us, in other words, with honest uncertainty. And honest uncertainty has its own kind of peace. It asks less of us than belief. It asks only attention to the record, to the absences, to the way chemistry can stand in for memory when everything else has fallen quiet, to the possibility that the history of intelligence on Earth may be broader, stranger, and more fragile than our current moment likes to assume. If some earlier civilization once stood where nothing now stands, if it shaped the air and sea and soil, and then passed away into the long, recycling dark, perhaps all that remains is a thin, stubborn signal somewhere under rock and pressure, waiting for minds patient enough to notice. And if no such civilization ever existed, the exercise still teaches something essential. It teaches us how temporary all grandeur is, how narrow the bridge is between presence and residue, how swiftly a world full of noise can become only data. For tonight, that is enough. Let the image settle slowly. Future geologists, or strangers, or descendants of something we cannot imagine, bending over ancient layers and finding our line. Not our faces, not our names, just the clear evidence that the planet once passed through a brief fever of thought and industry. If that can happen to us, then the old question will remain open a little longer, gentle and unsolved. Were we the first, or only the latest to burn brightly enough that stone, for a moment, remembered? There is one more place the past can hide when stone is gone and chemistry is too faint to sing on its own. It can hide in story, not in the strict sense of proof, not in the neat, cold language of dates and layers, but in memory carried mouth to mouth, winter to winter, parent to child, until the original event softens and gathers symbols around it. A flood becomes judgment. A fire in the sky becomes a god's anger. A drowned coast becomes a lost kingdom. A generation of survivors becomes the first people. If you were sitting here with me by the fire, listening to the small pop of resin in the wood and the almost invisible drift of smoke toward the rafters, I think this is the point where the mystery turns human again. We spend so much time looking for hard remains that we forget minds also preserve things. Not perfectly, not without distortion, but sometimes with astonishing persistence Oral tradition is fragile in one sense and strangely resilient in another. It does not hold exact measurements for very long. It rarely keeps names untouched. Yet it can hold structure, emotional truth, and place memory over spans that once seemed impossible. All over the world there are stories that seem to lean toward the same horizon. Great floods, coasts lost to rising water, fire from the sky, a former age of order ending in darkness, a world before this world. Most scholars are right to be careful with such stories. Similar myths can emerge independently because humans everywhere face water, storm, drought, night, grief, and the fear of ending. It would be foolish to treat every myth as a newspaper clipping from the ancient past. But it would also be foolish to assume myth contains nothing historical at all. In recent decades, researchers have shown that some oral traditions preserve real environmental memory far longer than older academic habits allowed. Indigenous Australian stories appear to remember coastlines that existed before post-glacial sea level rise. Other traditions hold details of volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, river shifts, and vanished lakes. Not always with literal language, not always with dates, but with enough consistency that geology eventually nods back and says yes, something like this did happen here. That matters more than it first appears to, because once you allow that memory can survive in transformed form, you have to ask what else might be surviving inside myth without announcing itself clearly. A flood story might not be only a flood story. A tale of a golden age may not be just nostalgia. A warning about pride and collapse may carry some dim impression of an actual social catastrophe. A recollection compressed until only the emotional architecture remains. I have always found it strange that so many cultures speak of earlier wisdom as though loss came before knowledge rather than after it. Not every tradition does this, of course, but many speak of a first time, a brighter time, a closer relation between people and sky and season, and then some break, some cooling, drowning, burning, scattering, or forgetting. You hear it in Mesopotamia, in Greek thought, in Indian traditions, in stories from the Americas, in island memories, in fragments that seem too geographically distant to have borrowed every detail from one another. Perhaps that says only that the human mind is built to dramatize change. Or perhaps, more softly, it says that the end of the Ice Age and the violence of shifting worlds left scars deep enough to become sacred narrative. The flood motif is the clearest. Sumerian accounts, biblical retellings, Greek variations, Hindu cycle, stories from indigenous communities in many parts of the world, all circling around sudden, overwhelming water and a before that can no longer be reached. We know now that the ending of the last glacial period involved massive sea level rise, failed ice dams, catastrophic outburst floods, and the drowning of vast coastal plains that had once been habitable. To people living through such transitions, the sea would not have been an abstract trend. It would have been a patient erasure at first, then a terror, then a permanent absence. Imagine what that would feel like if your people had lived for centuries on a broad shelf of rich coast, a place of shellfish, beds and estuaries and migratory birds, of reed houses, smoke, fish oil, carefully placed stones, seasonal paths your grandparents knew by foot and star. Then the shoreline begins to move inland, not in a single dramatic day at first, but enough that year by year, familiar places become marsh, then channel, then open water. Graves disappear. Camps are abandoned. Fresh water turns brackish. You retreat. You tell the children where the old ridge once stood. You name what has gone. The children tell their own children that the sea took the first homeland. Thousands of years later, the details are gone, but the shape of the grief remains. A flood, a lost land, survivors carrying memory inland. This does not prove that a vanished non-human civilization lies behind every myth. It proves something subtler and perhaps more useful. It proves that memory can outlive architecture. It proves that stories may preserve traces of environmental and social upheaval long after the material context is gone. And if that is true, then myths become neither literal history nor disposable fantasy. They become a different kind of archive. The lost land stories are especially haunting. Atlantis is the famous one, worn smooth by retelling until it often feels more like furniture than mystery. But there are many others. Lands to the west, islands that appear and disappear, coasts once joined, now broken apart by water, places remembered with impossible tenderness and impossible certainty. Most are wrapped in moral language because stories need meaning as much as facts. The land sank because of hubris, because of divine anger, because an age had become too heavy for itself. Yet beneath the moral frame there may still be the older pulse of a real drowning world. And then there are stories of teachers, sages, culture bearers, figures who arrive after catastrophe carrying techniques, calendars, farming, astronomy, law, healing, or sacred geometry. Mainstream interpretations usually treat these figures as mythic personifications of cultural change, and in many cases that is surely right. But one can still wonder, quietly, whether such figures may also preserve memory of actual survivors, actual knowledge keepers emerging from disrupted societies into regions that had lost continuity. Not gods, not miracles, just people whose skills, after collapse, would have seemed almost otherworldly. This possibility becomes less romantic and more plausible when you remember how fragile specialized knowledge is. Lose enough population and whole domains vanish. A midwife's method, a navigational system, a way of preserving food, a structure of seasonal reckoning. All can die in a few generations if the chain of teaching breaks. After a severe environmental shock, the surviving knowledgeable person may become the source of an entire local origin story. We were starving until she taught us. We wandered until they showed us the stars. They came from the sea. They came from the mountains. They came after the darkness. Some of the strangest traditions go further. Speaking of previous ages of humanity, not just prior generations. Ages in which people lived longer, knew more, stood closer to the sacred order of the sky. These are easy to dismiss because they are clearly stylized. Yet style does not cancel memory. A tradition may exaggerate duration and still preserve sequence. It may mythologize technology and still preserve event. Fire from heaven may be a poetic image, But it can also be the nearest language available to a people trying to remember volcanic rain, meteor fragments, or burning ejecta. A sky serpent may be myth, but it may also be the emotional shape left by a comet seen at the wrong time. You know that feeling when a dream preserves the mood of the day far more accurately than its details? Myth can work like that. It may fail at literal reporting while remaining faithful to pattern, to fear, to rupture, to the emotional geometry of what happened. That is why it deserves attention even when it resists direct translation. There is another delicate point here. If an older civilization had existed, whether human or not, we should not expect myths to describe it cleanly. Oral tradition, compress, moralizes, localizes, and adapts. Over thousands of years, stories are folded into ritual, territory, kinship, and identity. An ancient technological culture, if dimly remembered, would not survive as a technical manual. It would survive as ancestors, builders, sky readers, people who spoke with rivers, people who angered the heavens, people who knew things later generations no longer understood. Technology becomes magic very quickly when context dies. That transformation has already happened within recorded history in milder forms. Medieval observers looked at Roman engineering with awe and partial confusion. Later, people built myths around standing stones whose makers they had forgotten. Ruins invite imagination because they remain after explanation has thinned. How much more powerful would that process be across 10,000 years? 20,000? 100,000? The answer is almost inevitable. Precision becomes symbol. Skill becomes holiness. Disaster becomes mythic judgment. Memory survives, but in disguise. Still, caution remains essential. Similar myths do not automatically imply a shared prehistoric event. Human minds are good at producing recurring symbolic forms. Water is universally threatening and life-giving. Fire purifies and destroys. The sky governs season and survival. Any interpretation that leaps straight from narrative similarity to global lost civilization is moving too fast. Better to move slowly. Better to say only this. Myth is not proof, but it may be a clue to where proof is missing. It may tell us which absences mattered enough to become sacred. And sometimes the clue is not in the content, but in the persistence. Why does one image last? Why does a people keep telling of vanished coasts, or first teachers, or a former order broken by flood and cold? Because some stories fit too deeply into lived experience to be lost. They become containers for many eras at once. A real flood merges with a moral lesson. A social collapse merges with a cosmology. A drowned estuary merges with a memory of paradise. By the time the tale reaches us, it is no longer separable into clean components. But that does not mean it is empty. If our own civilization ended badly, and only fragments of its memory survived in oral forms, what would future listeners hear? They might hear of towers that touched the clouds and spoke to one another with invisible threads. They might hear of artificial suns, poisoned oceans, metal birds that crossed the sky, little glowing tablets that carried the voices of the dead, winterless years, fires beneath the earth, illnesses carried by breath, and a time when humans forgot how to stop wanting. It would sound absurd. It would also, in its strange, distorted way, be true. That thought helps me be gentler with old stories. Not gullible, not credulous, just gentler. We should not read myths as if they are transcripts, but neither should we flatten them into mere entertainment. They are evidence of what mattered enough to endure in human mouths. Sometimes that is theology. Sometimes power. Sometimes ecological memory. Sometimes grief. And grief may be the key word. A great deal of mythology feels like mourning shaped into form. Mourning for order lost, land lost, wisdom lost, contact lost. The prehistoric gap we have been circling may not be visible directly, but perhaps part of its outline survives as inherited sorrow. We remember, dimly, that the world has ended before, or seemed to. We remember that coasts move, stars change position, animals vanish, climates turn, and knowledge fails to pass intact. We remember enough to tell stories in which the world is renewed from scraps. By this point in the night, the fire has probably settled into a quieter bed of red, and the room itself may feel a little farther away, as if the walls are listening with you. That is fitting, because Part 7 belongs to the half-light between evidence and imagination. Here we are not proving. We are tracing. We are allowing the possibility that memory may travel farther than stone, though never in the same shape. If some earlier civilization did exist, perhaps its final monuments are not under the sea or buried in strange mineral layers, but alive inside stories no one now takes literally. And if no such civilization existed, then the stories still teach us something profound. They teach us that people have long sensed how fragile worlds are. They teach us that collapse, drowning, forgetting, and renewal are among the oldest patterns human minds have carried. They teach us that our ancestors were not naive, simply because they spoke in sacred images. They may have been preserving reality in the only vessel deep time reliably leaves to ordinary people: narrative. From here, only one step remains. Not a step toward proof, because this story does not end with proof, but toward humility. Toward the quiet recognition that we live on a planet old enough to have forgotten almost everything, and active enough to make certainty feel a little arrogant. The last part of this journey has to sit with that humility for a while, let it breathe, and then set it down softly. Because whether or not anyone came before us, the question has already done its work. It has made the ground beneath our confidence feel older, thinner, and more alive. So here we are, at the hush, at the edge of the question. After all the layers and cores, and drowned shelves and vanished signals, after the chemistry and myths and patient violence of stone, we have not found a hidden city. We have not uncovered the sealed library of some first people older than our own. We have not proven that another civilization rose on Earth long before ours and then slipped beneath the patient machinery of the planet. What we have done is something quieter. We have learned how little permanence really belongs to intelligence, and how much of the world's memory is made of fragments. There is a temptation, when facing a mystery like this, to force it closed, to say yes, someone came before us, because the idea is beautiful and eerie and satisfying. Or to say no, certainly not, because the evidence does not meet the hard standards history properly demands. But perhaps the most honest place to rest is between those reflexes. Not in indecision, but in disciplined wonder. The Earth is old enough to make certainty look small. The record is incomplete enough to make humility feel reasonable. If you have stayed with me this far, then you already know the shape of the dilemma. On one side lies the absence of direct proof. No unequivocal machine in ancient rock. No city cut clean into a layer 50 million years old. No inscription that plainly says, "We were here before you." On the other side lies everything geology and archaeology have taught us about erasure. Coasts drown. Sediments compress. Plates subduct. Organic things vanish. Surfaces are stripped and rewritten. Even our own industrial age, for all its scale, may someday amount to a thin chemical line and a few stubborn technofossils. That tension is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. I think that is why the question touches something deeper than curiosity. It is not only about whether we were first. It is about what being first would even mean on a planet this old. We measure significance by memory, by continuity, by the ability to point backward and say, here is where it began. But deep time cares very little for beginnings that cannot defend themselves against weather and pressure. Intelligence may bloom and vanish. Complexity may rise and dissolve. Civilizations may be less like mountains and more like brief, warm breaths on cold glass. That image might seem sad at first, yet there is comfort in it too. It reminds us that value is not dependent on infinite survival. A song matters even if it is not fossilized. A kindness matters even if it leaves no isotopic trace. A civilization may be meaningful even if the planet forgets its shape. The Earth is not a moral archive. It is a physical one. And physical survival is only one kind of endurance. Still, I cannot help returning to the scientific side of the question, because it sharpens rather than dims the wonder. Imagine future researchers, millions of years from now, reading our age through whatever methods their minds have devised. They may find a carbon pulse, a biodiversity crash, a thin glitter of synthetic residues, odd minerals, and strange isotope ratios. They may know from these clues that something organized, energy-hungry, and world-altering once lived here. Yet they may know almost nothing else. No names, no nations, no lullabies, no apologies, no small daily tenderness. Just a line in the rock and the changed world above it. If that is how we may someday appear, then why should we assume that no such line lies hidden deeper down, waiting in some forgotten basin, some unsampled shelf, some compressed ancient estuary, some layer everyone has already explained too quickly? I am not saying it does, only that the possibility remains within the physics of loss. That is enough to keep the question open. And maybe an open question is more nourishing than a closed one. Questions are how civilizations remain awake, the ones that stop asking, stop noticing. The ones that ask recklessly lose themselves in fantasy. The ones that ask carefully, slowly, with both rigor and imagination, are the ones that move the boundary between known and unknown by a few precious inches. Tonight we have been living in that careful kind of question. You know that feeling when you stand near the ocean at night and cannot see the horizon, yet you know it is there. That is what this mystery feels like to me. Not an answer concealed just beyond reach, but a vastness whose edge cannot be fixed from where we stand. We listen for evidence the way one listens for surf in darkness. Sometimes the sound is obvious. Sometimes it might only be wind in another direction. There is also the humbling possibility that we are not even asking the question in the right form. We imagine civilization through our own image. Urban, extractive, monument building, industrial, recorded. But another intelligence might not look like this at all. It might organize knowledge differently, shape environment lightly, build with perishable materials, never mine deeply, never leave dense cities, never seek scale in the way we do. Such a civilization might thrive beautifully and leave almost nothing we would know how to call advanced. In that case, our failure to find it would say more about our definitions than about the past. And if no one came before, if we truly are the first technological civilization this planet has hosted, that result is no less astonishing. It would mean that among billions of years of chemistry and struggle and extinctions and accidental beauty, intelligence capable of wondering about previous intelligence arose only once. Here, in us, in this narrow present. That is not a disappointment. It is its own kind of miracle. A fragile one. Perhaps the most fragile thing on Earth. That fragility is what lingers for me. Civilizations do not just rise. They must be maintained, taught, repaired, doubted, corrected, and made answerable to consequence. Otherwise, their own scale begins to work against them. The Silurian thought experiment, the drowned coastlines, the forgotten stories, the chemical ghosts, all of it folds back onto a very present lesson. No civilization is guaranteed a long memory. Not ours. Not anyone's. To exist at all is rare. To endure is rarer. To endure wisely may be rarest of all. By now, the room around us may have become almost abstract. Just warmth, shadow, and a voice moving slowly through the dark. Perhaps that is the right setting for this ending. Because I do not want to finish by trying to solve the mystery with a flourish. I would rather let it settle beside you the way old questions settle into old houses. Not as threats, but as company. Maybe the Earth has carried more minds than we know. Maybe entire experiments in awareness bloomed and vanished before our branch ever stood upright beneath the stars. Maybe there are no previous civilizations, only the immense power of time to make even one civilization seem impossible when looked at from far enough away. Maybe the truth is narrower than speculation. Maybe it is wider. We cannot say tonight. What we can say is this. The planet beneath us is not a stage built for our moment alone. It is an ancient, restless archive, one that preserves unevenly and forgets without malice. We are part of that archive now. Every road, every mine, every song stored on a failing server, every field cut from forest, every coral reef stressed by warming water, every fragment of plastic sinking through ocean dark, all of it is entering the slow translation from life into lair. That translation is already underway. And perhaps that is what gives the question its final gentleness. We are not outside the mystery, examining it from safety. We are inside it. Someday others may ask of us what we ask tonight of those who may or may not have come before. Were they first? What did they leave? Why is the record so thin? Why does the planet remember only their disturbance and not their dreams? If that future arrives, I hope our line in the rock is read with some mercy. I hope the ones who study us understand how much of a civilization is made of things too tender to fossilize. The ordinary love, the private courage, the late-night questions, the effort to know and to do less harm, the willingness to admit uncertainty and continue looking anyway. Those things may never survive materially, yet perhaps they matter most. For now, it is enough to know that the question remains alive. Not as a conspiracy, not as a promise, but as a disciplined invitation. Look closer. Sample deeper. Compare more carefully. Be wary of easy certainty. Let the old rocks remain strange when they are strange. Let myths be neither worshipped nor mocked too quickly. Let chemistry speak. Let silence mean silence, but not always finality. Before sleep takes you fully, I want to return once more to the simplest version of the question, because sometimes the simplest versions are the ones that stay. What if we are not the first civilization on Earth? Not the first minds to measure, to imagine, to alter the world around them in organized ways. If that were true, then the past is not a staircase, but a shoreline, washed over again and again, each tide leaving behind only the heaviest fragments. And if it is not true, then the shoreline image still holds, because even first things are shaped by forces older than they are. I think there is a reason this possibility unsettles people. It gently removes the comfort of uniqueness without replacing it with certainty. It leaves us suspended. Not diminished exactly, just repositioned. We stop being the obvious climax of the story and become one scene within it. Bright, perhaps. Consequential, perhaps. But still one scene. For some minds, that feels like loss. For others, it feels like relief. History becomes less like a trophy case and more like weather. There are nights when that thought would feel cold. Tonight, I hope it feels calm. Because to belong to a longer unknown sequence is also to belong, to be part of a world that has tried many things, preserved few, and still somehow produced us. Sitting here at the edge of sleep, asking whether intelligence has ever happened before on this spinning stone. That is not a small thing. Even the question itself is remarkable. And perhaps the final lesson is not about the past at all. Perhaps it is about stewardship. Once you see how little survives, you become more tender with what exists now. Rivers, reefs, languages, archives, soil, old songs, the quiet skills passed between generations, the habits that make a civilization livable rather than merely large. If deep time erases so much, then what we choose to protect in the short time given to us matters even more. Not because it will last forever, but because forever was never the point. Maybe those who might have come before, if they came, learned that too late. Or maybe they learned it well and lived lightly enough that we will never know them. Either possibility carries a warning and a blessing. Build, yes, but do not confuse scale with wisdom. Learn, yes, but do not mistake knowledge for permanence. Leave traces if you must, but remember that the finest parts of a civilization are often the parts no core sample can recover. So when you drift off in a moment, let the mystery remain generous. No hidden empire needs to rise in your mind. No lost machine needs to glimmer beneath Antarctic ice. Only this thought is enough. The Earth is older than any certainty we bring to it, and more patient than any explanation we hurry toward. That patience is not hostile. It is simply vast. And in that vastness, there is room for unanswered things. So let your thoughts slow now. Let the unanswered parts remain unanswered. Let the image of ancient layers, dark water, drifting dust, and faint chemical signatures loosen gently in your mind. If someone came before us, the Earth has almost finished whispering their name. If no one did, then tonight we have listened closely enough to understand how miraculous and how vulnerable our own brief presence really is. And perhaps that is the best place to leave it. Not with triumph, not with certainty, just with a softened sense of scale, and with the feeling that wonder does not need resolution to be worth carrying. The fire is lower now. The room is quieter. The planet is still turning beneath everything we know and everything we do not. Rest in that. Let the long ages move without you for a while. Let the old stones keep their secrets until morning. Good night.